Okay, welcome back for the final part of our discussion of World War II. Today, I'd like for us to look at Lesson 5, the victory for the Allies. So, how did the war come to an end, and what were some of the immediate outcomes of the war? Okay, the war ended in Europe in the spring of 1945. By March of 1945, you have the Allies crossing the Rhine River into German territory. The Soviets were already pushing from the east towards the city of Berlin. By April of 45, the Soviet and US forces met at the Elbe River, and you start to see the Axis powers beginning to surrender. In Italy, Mussolini is captured by partisans and executed. And in late April, Adolf Hitler commits suicide with the Soviet army just blocks from where he was. So in May, the Germans surrender. So May 7th, they surrendered. May 8th is called VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. And so that marks the end of the war in Europe, the European theater. Why were the Allies successful? Well, one reason is that Germany was basically fighting a two-front war. They could not maintain their momentum by having to fight on two fronts. They were powerful, but they weren't that powerful. And contrary to a lot of popular opinions, Hitler was not a very good leader. He made some very poor decisions. If he had listened to his generals, there might have been a different outcome, but he insisted on running the show, and consequently, Germany suffered from that. A lot of it also deals with the fact that the Germans underestimated the Soviet Union tremendously. Just like the Japanese underestimated the Americans, uh, the Soviets rose to the challenge and proved to be quite lethal to the German cause. They also tended to overlook the productive capacities of the United States. We had not been involved in the war. We had an economy that was intact and recovering from the Great Depression. And so we were able to supply the Allies in their fight against Germany. And of course, there was a massive bombing of Germany that took place that completely demoralized the German populace. So these are some of the reasons why the Allies were successful in Europe when they were. In the Pacific, there's still some more fighting that's going on. We've already mentioned that after Midway, you start to see the United States adopting a strategy of island hopping, where they're taking key islands in the Pacific that are going to isolate other Japanese held islands from supply lines that will make them surrender, but also it will give the Americans access to places to build bases to where they can launch raids against Japan. Um, by October 44, the Philippines were retaken from the Japanese. Places like Burma and Malaysia were liberated. And by 1945, by the spring, you start to see the Japanese really begin to feel this pressure. Most of their avian air force was destroyed. They're resorting to suicide bombings with kamikaze pilots. And in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, you have basically the entire Japanese population there fighting to the death. A lot of it is cultural, but it's just some bitter fighting to gain control over these islands. But with control of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, now the United States has a base that's very close to the Japanese main islands. And this is where the Manhattan Project starts to really show how there were some far-reaching plans in World War II that are ultimately going to have an impact on the world even to this very day. The Manhattan Project is the code name for the creation of the first atomic bomb, which, by the way, never had anything to do with the island of Manhattan, but it definitely makes people think that it was someplace that it wasn't. A lot of the testing took place out in the American Southwest. Uh, so these atomic weapons were tested, and there were proclamations issued to the Japanese to surrender or else. And in August of 1945, two Japanese cities were targeted for attacks using atomic weapons. The first of them was Hiroshima. On August 6th, 70,000 people killed instantly. And then 3 days later, Nagasaki, August 9th, 40,000 people killed instantly. And so there's a lot of debates, and you can see this within your reading about whether the United States should have done this, whether there were other options. And this is something that if you really want to get into a fight with someone, bring this up in certain occasions, and you certainly will. But the end result, though, is that the Japanese did surrender rather quickly. August 10th, they surrendered to the American forces. That's VJ Day, victory over Japan. And September 2nd, basically 5 years and a day after the war started, it ends with the signing of the Japanese surrender on the battleship Missouri that ended World War II. Okay, what were the end results of World War II? 50 million people dead. 30 million of these people were in Europe. 20 million of those were Soviets. Half of the people that were killed were civilians. So, this is what total war does. Large places of the globe were devastated. Germany, for example, the Soviet Union, Japan were in utter ruins. 20 million people were refugees. They're having to deal with the aftermath of this destruction. So there's widespread hunger, widespread disease. A lot of people had been through a lot of trauma. So there was mental illnesses. There was this also revelation of just how badly people can treat one another with the general release of information about the Holocaust and the knowledge of Japanese war crimes against civilians and the American military. One of the big outcomes post-war are the Nuremberg trials, trials that Germans and Austrians in particular that were guilty of killing people, torturing people, genocide were put on trial. Some of them were executed. Some of them were put in prison for life. This is where you have the definition of what a war crime is, and the fact that saying that you're following orders is never a justifiable defense when a war crime is committed. There were several other similar trials that were held in other places, like in Japan. Tojo, who was the prime minister, was actually executed. He was hanged for his contributions to the war. So this kind of stands out as an example of justice, but also how easy it is for people to just follow orders. Another big event that happened post-war is the creation of the United Nations, this forum for nations to solve their problems without going to war to keep the peace. The General Assembly of the United Nations has all of the member nations present, so they can debate and make some decisions. But the real power in the United Nations is the Security Council. There are only 5 permanent member nations there. There's a rotating schedule that other countries sit on this council. They have veto power, so any action that's made by the General Assembly can be vetoed by the Security Council. Only the Security Council can authorize things like sanctions or sending troops somewhere to keep the peace. So it's a very, very important group, and the United States has been involved with that since the end of the war. They do other things too, but like focusing on human rights, sending observers into places and documenting where human rights are being violated. Also, health, education, and economic programs are part of what the UN does. We're not going to be able to get into this because we just simply don't have time, but the end of World War II really started a different period in world history. The atomic age is what this slide describes it as, but I do want you to be familiar with the term Cold War, because the United States was the only country that had nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. The Soviet Union distrusted the United States. We maybe were allies during the war, but we rapidly became less than friends after the war. So the USSR wanted their nuclear weapons. So you see this race then between the United States and the Soviet Union to gain nuclear weapons. And so this this Cold War, which is not just about nuclear arms, it's also about ideologies. Communism with the Soviet Union, democracy and capitalism with the United States. The world was split into these two different camps. And this is something that dominated world politics until the 1990s. So, your parents were children when this all came to an end. So I wanted you to be familiar with the term Cold War. It's not something that we're going to be tested on, but it is something that next year in U.S. history you're going to be talking about quite extensively. So this concludes rather the notes for topic 12. Again, go over them, look at them, and if you have any questions, definitely get in touch with me, and I'll be happy to fill in any blanks that you might have.